Alright, so let's have some real talk here about building muscle on a vegetarian diet. If you take anything away from this video, let it be that you absolutely can do it. From a nutrition point of view, there is nothing stopping you building muscle on a vegetarian diet, and I'm going to run you through it so that by the end, you know how to. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to bust some myths for you and give you some real eureka moments. So, building muscle while on a vegetarian diet. Let's get into it, and let's start with going over protein intake. We're not going to go into protein itself in too much detail in this video, other than to say it is absolutely essential for building muscle. If you're on a low protein diet, then you're not going to be able to optimally build muscle. You need protein to stimulate something called muscle protein synthesis, and without sufficient dietary protein, this will be drastically limited. Now, this is the first myth that we need to bust, and it's that a review of the evidence shows that there doesn't seem to be any benefit in going above 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So that's about 1 pound of protein per pound of body weight. There seems to be a cap on protein intake in relation to muscle protein synthesis, so it doesn't really make sense to aim for super high protein levels like 3 grams per kilogram per day. If you're actively trying to build muscle, then I would suggest that you keep your protein intake between 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, or about 0.7 pounds to 1 pound per pound of body weight. So many numbers. This should give you sufficient amounts of protein without going crazy and gulping protein shakes down all day. If you're otherwise healthy, by the way, then this sort of protein intake is totally healthy as well, and it shouldn't have any effect on your kidneys or your bones or anything like that. If you have a health condition where you're worried about your protein intake, then have a chat with your family doctor. Along with protein itself as a whole, you also want to make sure that your diet contains a good quantity of leucine. Leucine is an amino acid which seems to be heavily involved in muscle building, so again, if you don't have good quantities of it, then you're limiting your muscle growth. You want to aim for about 3 milligrams of leucine in your meals, and I've put some info in the description for you, and you can check it out if you want some info on leucine containing foods. Just so you know in advance, this can be quite difficult, especially as a vegetarian, so don't worry if you aren't managing it. You can still build muscle, we're just talking about the optimum here. Now, how many of you do what I'm about to say? Small breakfast, or perhaps you skip breakfast. Not the biggest lunch, but you absolutely make sure that you pack a lot of food and protein into your evening meal. Well, that can harm your ability to build muscle. So instead, you want to be aiming to eat a good amount of protein over the whole day. Aim for at least 20 grams of protein in every meal, and that's a great starting point. We know from research that protein intake over the whole day seems to be extremely important for stimulating muscle growth rather than just focusing on one individual meal. Now, let's talk about protein shakes. Do you need them? You know, one of these guys? Well, the answer is maybe. They can be incredibly useful for vegetarians, but not strictly necessary. If you're planning on having a good meal after any sort of training session within about 45 minutes that contains a good amount of protein, then a protein shake probably isn't necessary. If it's going to be more than 45 minutes, then it's probably more useful because you can give your body the protein that it needs to start repairing and growing bigger or stronger muscle. And protein shakes don't just have to be after a training session. Although I would always advocate a food-first approach, and that is thinking of whole food options first and seeing if you can meet your needs with that, protein shakes can be useful for vegetarians. It's not always easy to get your protein intake up without them, or find foods which aren't really high in fat as well as protein. So it's not unreasonable to use them for that reason. However, before jumping straight for the protein shakes, I want you to have a think as to whether there's something that is probably in your fridge which might be just as good as a protein shake. What have you got for me? Milk. That's right. You said milk, didn't you? Milk is a fantastic tool for vegetarians to incorporate in their diet to help them build muscle. It is actually the base of most protein shakes anyway, because the most common form of them is whey protein, which is what milk contains. So 500 mils of semi-skimmed milk will contain about 18 grams of protein in, which is really quite impressive. You could have that on its own or easily combine it with some oats, some nut butter, fruit, and create a high protein healthy smoothie. Soy milk works well here too, by the way, but milk like oat or almond generally don't because the protein content is much lower. While we're on the topic of milk, let's talk about lean protein options for vegetarians. You might have heard meat eaters talk about lean meats, and what they're talking about are sources of protein with low amounts of fat in it. So things like low-fat beef, turkey, that sort of thing. Now, obviously vegetarians don't have that option, and I'm not suggesting you go out and eat those lean meats, but they have something similar which is excellent for building muscle. Going for low or no fat dairy options is a great way to increase the amount of protein content in the foods that you eat. For example, let's quickly compare some low to no fat dairy options against full fat options. If we take 200 milliliters of milk, with the full fat option, you get 130 calories, 7.5 grams of fat, and 7 grams of protein. If you swap to semi-skimmed milk, then it's 100 calories, 3.5 grams of fat, and 7 grams of protein. With normal fat Greek yogurt, 150 grams of it is 160 calories and 5 grams of protein. 150 grams of low fat Greek yogurt is 80 calories and 15 grams of protein. So low fat options like this usually contain less calories but more protein. So if you were to consume the same amount of calories, you'd simply be eating more protein. Not sponsored, by the way, I just really like this. This is an easy trick to bump up your protein intake as a veggie. But just to be clear here, fat isn't something that you need to be afraid of or that you should remove from your diet. It's actually super important for so many different reasons. So don't take this that I'm saying don't eat fat. This is just talking about trying to reduce the amount in certain dairy products to help with your protein intake. Healthy monosaturated fats like olive oil or almonds and nuts are perfect in your diet. Now, while we're on this whole low-fat dairy thing, it's a good time to talk about the pre-bed snack because it can be excellent for when you're trying to build muscle. Your body needs food to provide energy to function. When you sleep, your body still has the same needs, although granted they're a little bit lower. But unless you're sleep eating, you're not going to be eating much overnight, which means your body has to get the energy from somewhere. It can start to break down some of your muscle to do this, and that's where the bedtime snack can come in useful. If you have a slow digesting protein like casein, then you can help to reduce the amount of muscle breakdown that occurs. In short, you keep more of your hard-earned muscle. You can buy specific casein shakes, but you can essentially do the same thing with Greek yogurt. Greek yogurt contains a decent amount of casein protein, so a serving of it before bedtime with some nuts and berries could help you if you're struggling to build muscle. Now, I need to be honest with you here, and you might not like it, but it's something that you need to know. You can't build muscle and lose fat at the same time. Yep, you heard me. Building muscle while simultaneously losing fat just doesn't happen. Well, okay, I'll caveat that by saying there are some examples where it's possible, but in general, it's a no-go. You should put your focus into one or the other. You either build muscle or you lose fat and probably a little bit of muscle alongside it. The reason is that these are different goals and the underlying process that's happening in your body is different. To lose fat, you have to be in a calorie deficit. To build muscle, you need to be in a calorie surplus. Thus, it's pretty difficult to do both, especially if you're not super new to building muscle. So forget whatever you hear or read, whatever person tries to lure you in with a special sexy promise of doing both. Now, even if you're doing what we've already talked about so far, you won't magically gain muscle. If you are in a calorie surplus, eating enough protein, then nutritionally speaking, there's no reason that you shouldn't gain muscle. However, it doesn't mean that you will. You still need to put in the effort. You need a progressive training plan that increases load or intensity in one way or another. You have to put in the training sessions consistently. And that's a whole different thing to cover, and we're not going to go into it in this video. But suffice to say, if you follow what I've talked about in this video, from a nutritional point of view, you will be able to build muscle. So hopefully you found that useful. If you want to know a bit more about my favorite protein sources for vegetarians, then you should watch this video here.